I don't think that many of the people who called trans women she 4 years ago actually thought that trans women were women. They just thought that they didn't want to be rude to people's faces and it's good to be polite and so on. But look at what's happened in between, which is that large numbers of people have taken that to mean that we actually think they're women.
Hello and welcome to The View from 22. My name's Natasha Froese, I'm the Spectator's Deputy Broadcast Editor, and today we're going to be talking about turf wars. Has J.K. Rowling gone too far? That's what our writer Debbie Hayton writes about this week. She joins me now along with Helen Joyce, the writer. Debbie, you write in your piece this week that J.K. Rowling is playing with fire. Why is that?
Well, I've just noticed what happens on Twitter. Twitter is one of the most dreadful places on the internet, as far as I can see, and that debates get reduced sometimes just to ad hominem attacks. We're at a time now in this debate where I think the major battles have been won. Self-ID is in the bin. Women's sex-based rights are something that people talk about and people understand, and the Cass report is just huge in terms of what that's done for the NHS and for children. But we're in a position where still, when I go to school, when I go to work, and in my social groups, I still hear issues about the row on Twitter. It seems to be bigger than it should be, and I keep hearing about both sides. Well, both sides are as bad as each other, and it's just not true. But it's the sort of interaction I saw at the weekend, which gets thrown at me and says, this is what goes on. Here we've got a best-selling author with 14.1 million followers picking on somebody X, Y, and Z, this person, explain this. And I just think that it would be more helpful if we were making the case for what people believed in and what we're trying to achieve, rather than making these sort of issues a big thing. So that's why I wrote the piece.
And is this the first time you've noticed that your view might have strayed away slightly from some of the commentary that J.K. Rowling makes about gender critical feminism?
Well, actually, I don't disagree with anything that J.K. Rowling said. I think she's right. I think she speaks a lot of sense. I think her views are spot on. I just think that in this situation, that this was a battle on Twitter which she didn't need to fight. There's bigger and more important battles to be fighting than this. That's the point I was making.
And for anyone that hasn't seen the tweet, J.K. Rowling has written about a trans football manager who's a manager for a women's football team, and has said, "When I was young, all football managers were straight, white, middle-aged blokes. So it's fantastic to see how times have changed." Helen, what did you think about Debbie's piece and the point she's trying to make?
I very much disagreed with all of it, although I don't disagree with Debbie's preamble there. It is true that major battles are being won. I don't think we're there yet. I think we can always backslide. I think that there's some very important context that has been left out of the summary that the two of you have between you produced for that piece. So the person in question, I think the name is Lucy Clark, is a man who identifies as a woman who I think now manages a women's football team. That's fine. Men can manage women's football team. Many men do. The point was that somebody was presenting this as a win for women. They were saying that it was about diversity. And that's ridiculous. And if women have to accept that men who identify as women are women for the purposes of diversity, we're never going to get actual diversity. We have to be able to say, this man identifies as a woman, but he's not a woman. And therefore, this is not a blow for diversity. And that's what J.K. Rowling was doing. Now, was she being unkind about it? Obviously, it's not something that this particular person wants to hear about themselves. And in social situations, many people would not make that point directly to someone's face, largely because they think it's awkward. But sometimes it's necessary. And there are actually situations where women do need to be able to say to particular men who identify as women, you do you, but you're not a woman. Don't come into this space, it's only for women. No, I'm not going to count you as a woman for the purposes of diversity. No, you're not going to talk over women and say that you represent women in certain situations. And then the last thing that was left out of that account is that this particular person has been relentlessly trolling J.K. Rowling and other women, totally unprovoked, calling people bigots, transphobes, using nastier words than that for many months. So this is not somebody who has the right to turn around and say, be kind. This is somebody who we could say, no, you be kind. And also, I would really do take issue with the idea that it's not what we're saying, it's how we're saying it. The fact is, I have said everything as kindly and nicely as I can, and I still get told not to say it. There is no way that you can say to a man who identifies as a woman but insists he is a woman, that fine, he can do what he likes, but he can't actually come into women-only spaces, and you reserve the right to say that the reason is because he's a man. That doesn't offend him. The word man, the words he, him, male, these are not slurs. These are not the equivalent of the N-word. They are very ordinary words for the half of humanity that is not entitled to come into women-only spaces. And unless we can call individual men who claim to be women, men, when they are trying to overstep our boundaries, we cannot police our boundaries. So yes, I really very much disagreed with both the tone and the content of Debbie's article, though I think the two of us would probably agree on where we are in the movement as a whole and what the biggest fights are. We cannot win this if we cannot use our language clearly.
Debbie, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to what Helen said, but can I just double check, Helen, is there any world in which a trans person in women's sport can be seen as a win for diversity?
I don't think so, actually. I think the problem with having a man who identifies as a woman being called a woman and coming in a diversity sort of spot is it's actually worse than just having a man. Because this is not only a man, but it's a man who claims to be able to speak for women. So actually, it's a real problem. I mean, in general, there's very little that women get to do in sport compared with men. So female people or women, she, hers, whatever the words you want to use, coming into a sport like football where nearly all the money, nearly all the attention goes to men, that's what diversity is. And of course, then there'll be other sorts of diversity to do with, age or religion or belief or race or whatever. But on sex, really, the meaningful issue in football and many other sports is really whether women, female people, can get a fair shake.
Debbie, what do you think about what Helen said? You've obviously had a lot of backlash and reaction to people you usually agree with quite a lot on this topic. How do you respond?
Well, I'd say why pick on this particular tweet and why the response? I think if the response had been, I don't think this is a victory for women, I think that would have been one thing. But to say almost a sarcastic remark that when I was young, all the football managers were straight middle-aged blokes. So it's fantastic to see how much things have changed. It's encouraging other people then to pile on to that. And it encourages those dog piles that we see on Twitter. It's unpleasant. It's nasty. I think as well, I'd also question, why pick on this? This is a tweet from some minor, unknown organisation pushing something on Twitter to its own followers. I suspect they can't believe their luck in suddenly being promoted to so widely and to so many people. And the same with the person concerned. I understand what Helen's saying about what's been said to J.K. Rowling. There's no love lost between me and that person either. We've had our own run-ins over the time. But on one hand, I don't pick up from the output on Twitter that person is in any way upset about this. They're delighted because they're the centre of attention. That's what's happened to them. But at the same time, this can be used by opponents to make to frame this person as some sort of victim, which I do not think they are. But this is the way it's framed and then presented to the wider public. That's what I think is unhelpful.
And Debbie, lots of people that have come out to support you in your piece have started saying things like, okay, well, this is where you can see the transphobia in the gender critical movement. What do you think about that?
Well, I think we're in a very emotional space where people are worried about words being redefined to their disadvantage, and in that sort of context, and I put that at the top of the piece because I understand how emotionally people feel about this. So when you start talking about it, when you open it up in print, you expect that response. But I think it's healthier to talk about these things than keep them bottled up, because when we talk about them, we can understand where different people are coming from.
Which is, of course, what J.K. Rowling was doing. I mean, you simultaneously said that it's best to talk about these things and that she shouldn't have talked about it, at least not in the words she used. I mean, she's a brilliant writer. She's one of the world's most famous and successful writers. I don't think she ever says anything on Twitter that she hasn't given some thought to. I think her tweet was excellent. I think it made a funny and witty point, which got it across a lot faster than having to talk and beat around the bushes and say, is male different from man? And, call a male person they because you don't want to pick a pronoun and so so on. Women are really very sick of being told that they aren't saying things right or that their message would have been heard if they had put it more nicely. Actually, the thrust of Debbie's piece was largely that J.K. Rowling had moved a lot, that everything was very different about what she says now and what she said 4 years ago, and that was the same for the gender critical movement. We haven't moved at all. What has happened is that a lot of women have seen their willingness to be polite absolutely taken advantage of. So I think she would stand by every word of her famous tweet about that she would stand with trans people, that you can, wear what you like, sleep with who you like, all of that sort of thing. She would stand by every word of that. What it's come down to is that people who don't identify as their sex have taken other people's politeness as a license to override other people's desires, needs, rights, and boundaries. And the women who have been abused and gaslit by men in relationships knew that this would happen. They said all along that if you play along with people who are just saying, just give me this little inch, just be kind, just be quiet, just, say these words because they make me feel better, that those people, those men would then take advantage and take a mile. And that's what we've seen. I don't think that many of the people who called trans women she 4 years ago actually thought that trans women were women. They just thought that they didn't want to be rude to people's faces and they didn't want to be mean and that people were miserable and it's good to be polite and so on. But look at what's happened in between, which is that large numbers of people have taken that to mean that we actually think they're women and that they're entitled into women's places. And that it's a blow for women's rights when a man who identifies as a woman gets something. So we've had to take back our language. It reminds me of a sign when I was a child that shopkeepers used to have behind the till that said, "Do not ask for credit because a refusal often offends." Don't ask to come in. Don't ask me to call you a woman if by that you mean that you're entitled to come into women's spaces or to count as a woman. And then I won't have to refuse and you won't have to complain.
Helen, I think this is indicative, this conversation, even though it was a small tweet and it's obviously blown up, I think it's an example of the fact that we've got to a place with this gender critical conversation where actually in a lot of cases, Debbie said at the beginning, the gender critical movement has won. You might not necessarily believe that, but lots of people are making that case. But the movement's become so large. We had Julie Bindel host her own show on Spectator TV that she says the minute a group becomes big enough to have disagreements, that's when it's kind of been a success. Have you noticed now that there's a lack of cohesion amongst gender critical feminists, or is this something you've just always been aware of?
Oh, it's always been true because there are so many reasons that people actually decide that it's worth fighting to be able to say that there are two sexes and sex can't change. Like people come into this for religious reasons, for scientific reasons, for free speech reasons, because they're feminists, because they care about child safeguarding. And those people agree on nothing else. They may be all across the political spectrum. So this has never been a cohesive movement. It's such a basic thing to agree on that there are two sexes and that matters, that of course you'll get all sorts of people in it. I cannot emphasize enough that this is not splitting the movement. Very, very, very few people actually ever thought that the courtesy or the cowardice, whichever you prefer to call it, of referring to a man as a woman because that man wants to be referred to as a woman actually meant anything for what you believed. And then belatedly, they realized that, their politeness or kindness was being taken advantage of. And now what you're seeing is people saying, well, if you're taking advantage of my kindness, I'm not going to be kind anymore. But that's not a split. This really is not a split.
Debbie, I want to ask you about the role of trans people in this movement, because you're one of few that we know of that will talk about gender critical feminism. Do you think that this area is welcoming to trans people?
I think as a trans person, you need sometimes the hind of a rhinoceros, but that's the same in any political environment where you're arguing a case, you're making a political point, and especially when it's so personal. What I see happening here is, yes, the battles have been largely won. We mustn't rest on our laurels here, or opponents will seize the advantage. And what I worry is, instead of just making a general point that about sport, about language. It's framing one particular person as framing one particular person allows that person to claim victim status, and that I think was unnecessary, because we are sadly in a culture where people use victim status in order to exert power. And by over what happened at the weekend, I think we could have made more progress by talking about the issues more generally, without making an issue out of one individual who is probably enjoying the attention immensely.
That's a perfectly reasonable argument. One can agree or disagree on it. Very often I will deliberately make points at a general level. I will reply to people who ask me to say something specific by making a general point. But that is, again, not the point that Debbie made in the article that we're talking about, and J.K. Rowling is entirely entitled to come to a different call. I would just like to add one thing here, which is it is also very painful and very personal for women to be told that a man who identifies as a woman is actually a woman. It's presenting being a woman as being a bunch of stereotypes. It's extremely regressive. It means that we have to remain silent about what we can see with our own eyes, that we have to police our own tone and so on. And far too often, this is presented as if the only people who have skin in the game are the people who identify as trans. Actually, everybody has skin in the game when we try to redefine what sex is, but in particular women and children do. So I totally reject that framing that the issue here is how trans people feel about it. I would like people to remember how women feel about it too.